So our goal is to look at the more radical plan for Reconstruction. Radical being Republicans who wanted to be punitive with the Confederacy following the North's win in the Civil War. Now, as the war was drawing to a close, it becomes clear that the 4 million slaves who are about to achieve freedom are going to require some type of government assistance to get on their feet. General Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton met with leaders of the Freedmen in Savannah, Georgia in January 1865 to discuss possible solutions. Now, the leaders are mainly Methodist and Baptist ministers, and their response is land. Land is the most immediate need because it would provide freedmen with the best way to take care of themselves. The place chosen to start this so-called experiment was the Sea Islands, and the Sea Islands are a kind of a series of islands off the coast of South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. But it really became kind of a haven for black settlers during the war. Now, Sherman issued an order that established the area as exclusive to black settlement, and he also began to divide the land into parcels of 40 acres. General Sherman also mentioned that he had some army mules that he could lend to the settlers to help them get started on their land. And this gives rise to the expression 40 acres and a mule. This action ended up only, unfortunately, applying to the Sea Islands because President Johnson was against land redistribution and wanted to return all confiscated land to their original owners. So, with the whole 40 acres and a mule, this does become a rallying cry, but unfortunately, little comes of it. 2 months after Sherman issued this field order, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to help out freed slaves in the South. And again, one of their first tasks was to lease out the Sea Islands land in 40-acre parcels. And we're talking 300,000 acres of land. The Bureau distributed clothing to the freedmen, although in many accounts, white Southerners are going to deride the clothing as hand-me-downs. There were Northerners who traveled south, and they attempted to help freedmen acquire employment and find their family members. The Bureau even supervised about 15,000 schools and attempted to encourage and enforce attendance. The initial teachers were all white, and the eventual goal is that through the process of education, black educators would take over to run and staff these Freedmen's Bureau schools. In early 1866, a bipartisan congressional committee recommended a bill that would extend the Bureau, since initially the sole purpose of the Bureau was to aid war refugees. This would take it a little bit further. President Andrew Johnson vetoed the bill because of his insistence on states' rights and his belief that the Bureau would rely too much on the military during peacetime. This veto prompts Thomas Nast of Harper's Weekly to draw what you see here. He'll depict President Johnson, the veto, kicking over a bureau, a cabinet, labeled Freedmen. So he's kind of derided for this. Now, the Bureau continued its work, but lost most of its funding in the late 1860s and was disbanded by 1872. So this reality that Johnson doesn't necessarily support the work of radical Republicans will lead to the new radical plan. And remember, this is when they have a super majority in the House and the Senate. It's veto-proof. The new radical Congress really wasted no time putting their own stamp on Reconstruction. So in March of 1867, the Reconstruction Act was passed over another veto of President Johnson. The lone exception, the lone Confederate state that eventually is excluded. Tennessee will be excluded because they had already accepted the 14th Amendment and were readmitted into the Union. But the remaining 10 states were divided into 5 military districts. 1 million former slaves are going to become enfranchised in the process. And ex-Confederate leaders were barred from voting or holding public office. Black residents would be registered to vote by military commanders, and then the eligible voters would elect delegates to a state constitutional convention, where the new state constitutions would guarantee universal male suffrage. This act accomplished the following objectives. All right, the right to vote was secured for freedmen. It made it more likely that Republicans would control these new southern state governments, and it required southern states to accept the power of the federal government and thus the end of slavery. Even moderate Republicans were satisfied with the laws because they saw them as validating the results of the war and ending any further rebellion, rather than simply actively punishing the South. Now, there were certain individuals who benefited from these new policies more so than others. Carpetbaggers was a derogatory term for Northerners who either stayed in the South after the war because they were there already, or they had traveled to the South from the North after the end of the war for economic gain. I mean, there were some who sought to aid in a so-called social revolution, but many sought business opportunities. And you see the name, C. Schurz, Carl Schurz, emphasizing the fact that he is a Wisconsinite headed south. With his mission, he becomes the symbol of these carpetbaggers. Now, these individuals were ridiculed throughout the South, and some were despised, but again, there were some who set up successful businesses. Any white Southerner who joined the Republican Party was referred to as a scalawag, and these included, small farmers, unionists, and merchants. Some joined because there were financial benefits to becoming Republicans and endorsing the majority. But many white Southerners believed that the Republican Party was a party that would only serve black Southerners, and any Republican government would never be legitimate in their eyes. So the Republican Party, the concept of radicalism, these are being really decried, especially in the South. Now, amidst all of this, we get Reconstruction Amendment number 2, the 14th Amendment. Radical Republicans were worried that the southern states would move quickly to find ways to disenfranchise freedmen and deny them of their civil rights in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It was pretty well known that President Johnson was an avowed white supremacist, and Republicans wanted to ensure that protections for freedmen would be veto-proof. Now, the other side of the coin here is that with 4 million freedmen, mostly concentrated in the South, they're free. They are counted for population purposes. This means the 3/5 compromise no longer applies, and each black resident would count towards additional seats in the House. This benefits the South, but also the Democratic Party. The solution is the 14th Amendment. Now, this is officially ratified mid-1868. It explicitly prohibited states from violating the civil rights of their citizens, which, this supposedly makes the black codes unconstitutional, and it provided states with a choice. Either enfranchise their black citizens who are of age, or lose representation in Congress. Now, the first part of the amendment guaranteed citizenship to all freedmen, as well as due process and equal protection under the law. The second part is where the Republicans got a little creative. If the right to vote was denied to any males age 21 and over, then said state that was disenfranchising would lose representation in Congress. This is meant to somewhat offset the loss of the 3/5 compromise, although it was derided for not directly addressing the suffrage of these black male freedmen. That is a task that's going to come with the final Reconstruction Amendment to be ratified in another 2 years.